Welcome to the Trellix Spotlight series. My name is Nick, and I will be your host. Today's session will focus on the Network Security Platform's Device Manager update. This webinar will be recorded. If you prefer not to participate in the recorded session, please feel free to disconnect at this time. A link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This webinar is a brief overview covering common use cases and scenarios regarding this topic. It is not intended to be all-encompassing. If assistance is needed, please contact Trellix Technical Support. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A window. This webinar may run longer or shorter based on your participation, and we recommend asking as many questions as you can to make the most of this series. If you experience any audio issues during the webcast, please drop and attempt to reconnect. Our presenter today is Matt Zipf. Matt is a Master Technical Support Engineer and has been with Trellix for 15 years. He currently supports NSP and ATD and has a bachelor's degree in computer science. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt.
Thanks, Nick. My name is Matt Zipf. I'm here today to talk about the new Device Manager features in 10.1.7.55 and higher. Go briefly over what was in the previous version and what is new. We'll have a big demo. So previously, the Device Manager was a primarily read-only view. You could see details on the sensors, but you couldn't do any real changes there. Like the Add button brought you to the Add Remove Devices tab. The only main exception to that was the stacks window let you create stacks here. It's about the same as in the new one. So this includes several tabs over on the left here. Device Manager, Add Remove Devices, failover pairs, all the VNSP settings. These are all rolled into the Device Manager's primary screen in the next patch. So most of those areas have been removed and integrated into various tabs on the Device Manager. We'll go into that in the demo. And we'll go right to that. Here is the new Device Manager. The first thing I'd like to point out is the connection status. When you have sensors connected to the manager, if something is wrong with one of them, like the sensor's down, it will show you that either it is partially or fully down. In this case, the sensor is disconnected from the manager and all the channels are down. But this could also just be showing like a single channel down, and it would give you good status either way. In this case, this is actually happening because that particular sensor has been disconnected using the sensor deinstall command. If I set it back, it'll show back up in the manager. So I'll get that started. When we're looking at adding and removing devices, if we add a new sensor that hasn't been connected, just like you would in the previous version, you've got to set a shared secret key, tell it the kind of device, explain the deployment mode, and then save. But previously, this was under the Add Remove Devices screen over on the left here, but that is now a plus button in the Device Manager. And there's a similar remove button for removing ones you don't want. So when I add a new sensor, it will show up in the list as a different status than disconnected once that finishes. So it says trust pending because this sensor has never connected to the manager. If I were to double click on one of these, it will show all of the same information that we saw in the add remove, plus all of the other information that's available in the table that we'll get to in a bit. There's a lot of information available here that was not previously available on this screen. So as you can see, this one is starting to come back up. So in addition to the channel status, there is a column that shows you whether the current signature set has been applied to that sensor or not, and what the current signature set on the manager is, callback detectors. This can take a little while to check because it has to talk with all of the sensors and all of the servers where the manager gets this information. In this particular case, the sensor is a bit behind because it hasn't been pushed to yet, because the sensor is in 9500. It doesn't have a license yet. Um, Once you get past the protections column, we get into the device details, and there are a lot of little details here. All of this can be customized to show or not show all of these little settings. But we'll just go through them real quick. There's the sensor or NTPA, what model of sensor, what's the serial number of the sensor, what version is it currently on, uh, what firmware revision, or hardware revision rather, uh, whether or not it needs a reboot for anything. In this particular case, one of these sensors does require a reboot because the configuration that I've got set by default doesn't match what was defaulted on the sensor for the snort rule engine, so it needs a reboot. And this actually brings me to something else I want to mention. HA pairs are another new tab where to create an HA pair, you go into this tab, say new, and over here, you can select the model and sensor and fill that in just like the same information as before. If you try to do this and you've got some value that doesn't match up between the two, it will warn you. Like in this particular case, one of these sensors needs a reboot to make it match what it's configured for. So it won't let me create the HA pair right now. So while we're going through the rest of this, I'm going to tell this sensor to reboot through the other actions menu. We've got several miscellaneous actions you can do. You can reboot, shut down, uh, reset the password for a specific device, or upgrade selected devices. Upgrade can do multiple devices at once, but if you try to do different models, it will give you a warning. We can't upgrade more than one model and software version difference. So if these two NS9500s were on different versions, I couldn't upgrade them at the same time. Or if I try to upgrade different models, I can't do them at the same time. I can do one and then the other while they're processing in the background. But in this case, I want to reboot this box. And in this case, I want to do a full reboot. So that should go in the background. If you have ever upgraded a sensor here, the upgrade status will show what the current state is, whether that has finished or is in the process. And I'll plan on doing that briefly in the future here after we get the sensors into an HA pair. If it's in a virtual NSP cluster, there's the virtual NSP information available. If the sensor has ever been upgraded through this manager, it'll be listed here. For systems that require a license like the NS9500, it'll show the licensed capacity, what they're licensed for, and what they're actually set for. In this case, it isn't actually licensed. So I can select a license here. This is exactly the same license assignment screen that we had under the manager area over here. It's just now available within the device manager now. So I'll get both of these licensed. And after I get them both licensed and that other one comes back up, we'll show how we do a deploy now, or as it's called, the sync in the new version of the Device Manager. After the license information, we have information on the stack that the sensor might be a part of. In this case, these sensors are not part of a stack. Um, Speaking of stacks, making a stack is very similar to making an HA pair, except that you don't use existing sensors to make a stack. You make a stack from the start, and it makes them as a stack. So I just tell it what kind of stack I want. So, and when I name it, it will create the sensors in the stack and add them to the list. I don't actually have a stack license available right now, so I'm not going to be doing that. But once you've done this, you can see the stack shows up in the list. And if we go back into the screen here, refresh. While this is loading, I can point out the include child domains checkbox here. In previous versions of the manager, the device manager only showed the sensors that were in the current domain. If you had any subdomains, they would not be included. Now there's a check by default that includes that information. So you can see subdomain sensors. Connecting. If that other sensor is finished rebooting. Not quite. Process. That's probably why it's taking so long. This is doing. Give some time by assigning the license on the other screen. All right, so in this screen now, in addition to that test sensor I made earlier, there is now the two stack sensors. That would, you join it as stack 1 and stack 2. Once you connect those to the manager, and then there's 9500 to the manager under that name, it would show up and join the stack properly. If you have sensors that are already connected to the manager and you want to make them into a stack, you need to remove them and create a stack and then have it connect under that name. But now that we've created a stack, the stack name shows up here with the capacity and whether or not a license is required. You can't assign the license here. It has to be done through the Stacks tab. If the sensor is a member of an HA pair, it will show up. What's the current IP address and default gateway, FIPS version, previous reboot time, what subdomain it's in, lots of simple details. For the comment field, you can set a comment either by double-clicking and setting a comment, or in the when you add a sensor, you can set the comment if you have anything you want to record. Next, we have the sensor health check. In this particular case, these two sensors do not have both power supplies plugged in, so they're showing up as abnormal. But if there was something else wrong, it would show up here as well. Maybe the physical ports aren't up. And after that, we have the list of faults. So each sensor has always had faults, and that's been available under the manager in the logging area. We now have a summary of it here. If you click on one of the little eye symbol next to some of the faults, it will show you what that fault is. Um, we can show any faults, and we may need to show more than 12 hours. Uh, like if they said 3 in that list, but when I went to this page, there was only 1, and that's because the screen here lists all faults in the database, regardless of timestamp. But once I go to this screen, it filters it based on time. So if you've got a sensor that has showing that it has 10 faults and it only shows 3 here, you may have to change the time period to longer, either the last 14 days, or sometimes I've had to go extremely long time periods, like years, if I had really old sensors to show an old fault. Uh, this particular case, these are all things that are just part of the normal setup here. Um, After the faults, it shows us whether or not the sensor needs a sync or deploy, as it was previously called. All of these sensors do need a deploy. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can just select one and click sync, or we can hold shift or control like any selection and select all of them and hit sync. Then it'll ask us which pieces we want to do. And in this case, I wanted to start it for all of them. Looks like this one is still showing disconnected in this screen. I probably need to refresh it. But if we go back over to the sync here, refresh, it'll show us that it's in progress. Now this one is connected again, so I can sync this one as well. It's still loading, so it won't let me start it. Need to wait a second here. The the wait time here is for the sensor and the manager to check all of the sensors and to check the um, up callback detector SIGSET GAM latest versions before it gives us a status update on this. Previously, this could actually take quite a long time and would sometimes cause the screen to not load. So they changed it so that it would just cause the screen to load and tell you that, oh, the this particular piece needs an update. So just the parts that take a long time don't load immediately. So in this case, I just want to sync. Again. You can also, of course, look under the running task to see if something's currently active. So got deployments running. We just started for the 9500. already running. Yeah. So I started it a couple times. So we get all of the sensors deployed and up to date. I will go ahead and create an HA pair as well, just to run through that and show you how that looks. Let's see. Resetting the CLI password, usually you only ever need to do that for one box at a time. But it's just like the previous releases. You do that, it sets it back to the admin 123 default. The other thing that has changed significantly is the summary page for the sensors is now the same as the device manager. It has the same information as the device manager page, just laid out slightly differently. This is basically exactly the same data that shows up in the double-click menu on the right, just laid out with 3 columns instead of 1. So for regular sensors and for like the HA nodes, the summary will show this. For HA pairs, there's just a little same summary that you get here. It looks about like this. See, the reboot is no longer required on this one, so we should be able to make the HA pair now. So now that an HA pair has been created, there's no double click on them. But if we go under devices and refresh this, it'll show up as NS9500HA. And the summary page will show us whether or not we need to deploy, what are the 2 nodes, and then the member sensors have the new summary screen here. If I wanted to queue up an upgrade for these, if I select the 2 and hit upgrade, and as long as they are the same model and the same current sensor version, I can tell it to upgrade to a new version and reboot. You do not have to check the reboot, in which case you'll have to manually reboot them afterwards. So now that it shows the upgrade is in progress, it shows a configuration change because the HA was done. So I'm doing two things at once here. I'm turning it into an HA and upgrading it. I probably should have pushed out the HA upgrade before I upgraded it. I don't think that'll cause any issues. It doesn't show very much in the status screen. Slightly better information in here. Looks like this one had some sort of fault internally on that sensor. I'll have to look at that later. This is just in my lab, and we've got a lot of just small little things that happen here. So the 6-at worked to the 9500, and now it's doing the upgrades. We log onto one of those sensors. It's probably still building the policy on the manager. Hasn't started talking to the sensor yet. Eventually, it will get to this sensor and upgrade. One other thing to notice, as I'm scrolling through these details, the sensor name column doesn't move. That's always on the left so that you can tell which one is which. See, the device manager is also getting a significant update in the central manager in a future release, probably later this year sometime. But what that will be is basically a read-only version of this on the central manager, showing the data from all of the regional managers. It'll be helpful if you're using a central manager and you have a lot of managers try to find things. It should be a lot simpler to work with. That about sums it up. All right, back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Matt. As a reminder for everyone, Trellix Education Services offers exceptional training to go along with our award-winning products. If you would like to learn more, please visit the website listed on the screen to see all of our offerings. Let's get our Q&A session started. I see we have several questions, but it's not too late to add your question. Please type it in the Q&A window to submit. Additionally, take a moment to fill out the survey. Your feedback and suggestions are always appreciated.
How does the manager know if it should display the VNSP tabs in the device manager?
The manager displays those only on the MLOS-based managers. So if you've got a Windows manager, the VNSP tabs don't show up in the display like we saw here in the demo. This is on a Windows manager, so the VNSP options weren't there. If you had a MLOS manager, those would show up.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Do you have any upcoming trainings for NSP architecture and some best practices on designing the solution? I'll take this one, Matt. We don't have any upcoming class trainings for NSP, but we do have our essentials training available on our training site, and I'll give you that link here in just a moment after we close off the webinar. I actually think that's all the questions that we've got for today's session. Let me just double check here. Yeah, it looks like that's everything. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and a big thank you to Matt. As a reminder, a link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all participants. This will conclude today's webinar. Stay safe, everyone.